Welcome everyone to another edition of the Classic Comic Archive, a series where I recap and review many of Marvel Comics' most seminal early issues. Our story for today is The Amazing Spider-Man 10, cover dated March of 1963. This issue marks the first appearance of minor villains, the Enforcers, and the Big Man. The issue was written by Stan Lee, drawn by Steve Ditko, and lettered by Sam Rosen. Our issue opens up with a striking splash page, teasing Spider-Man's coming battle with the Enforcers and the Big Man. But before we can witness such an epic showdown, we must first travel to the flagpole of a towering skyscraper. Perched on its end is a burglar who's trying to escape from the police. While there's nowhere for him to go, the police aren't foolish enough to pursue him. So he's simply stuck there, in the perfect spot for Spider-Man to swoop in. Yet just as the web slinger goes to grab him, he's suddenly yanked upwards. There'd been a hidden cable wrapped around him the whole time, itself attached to a hidden helicopter hovering above. Spider-Man hadn't noticed either, and is about to let the burglar get away. So he lunges after the helicopter, but is repulsed by a sudden torrent of liquid foam. He's sent tumbling to the ground, but breaks his fall with a hastily fashioned web parachute. He spends the next few seconds awkwardly gliding to the ground, as a group of onlookers jeer at his embarrassing failure. This was all part of the Big Man's plan. He's New York City's newest crime boss, and the mastermind behind the plot. He'd orchestrated the jewelry heist just to lure out, and then publicly humiliate Spider-Man. Armed with an intimidating mask and some old-fashioned cunning, he's taken over New York's crime syndicate, and he's got the Enforcers to keep everyone in line. They're three of New York's nastiest thugs, each with a special knack for fighting. Take Fancy Dan, a diminutive judo master. Or take Ox, a mountain of a man, who can shrug off the mightiest of blows. And take Montana, a lasso expert, who can lash, whip, and disarm any opponent with just his rope. But enough of the Enforcers, let's turn our attention back to Spider-Man, or should I say Peter Parker, as he's just arrived at the hospital to visit his Aunt May. She'd undergone an operation in the last issue, and while there weren't any major complications, she's in need of a blood transfusion. Luckily Peter has the same blood type as his aunt, yet he's worried that his blood's been affected by the radioactive spider bite that gave him his powers, and he's concerned that he'll expose his identity by having it tested. So at first he refuses, but then realizes that helping his aunt is more important than preserving his identity. So he lets them take his blood, but they luckily don't notice anything unusual about it. He's left a little weakened by the loss though, and can only hope that he won't be needed as Spider-Man for the next few days. In any case, he then visits his aunt, and among other things, tells her that she's been invited to join their neighbors on a week-long trip to Florida. She jumps on the opportunity, and on that very same day, gets discharged from the hospital and leaves for Florida. While I'm sure the two aren't connected, her exit happens to coincide with a sudden crime wave that erupts in the city. It's the Big Man's syndicate, as he's strong-armed most of the city's gangs into working for him. Those who refuse to join are paid a visit by the Enforcers, who have an uncanny ability to change people's minds. Of course their antics don't go unnoticed by Spider-Man, as he stalks the streets at night, trying to find a trace of the Big Man's true identity. Yet he and the police only catch the small fry, as the Big Man and his Enforcers remain aloof. But not everyone's convinced that the Big Man even exists. J. Jonah Jameson, publisher of the Daily Bugle newspaper, and Spider-Man's biggest hater, thinks the wall crawler and the Big Man are one and the same. So he tasks Fred Foswell, one of his best reporters, to write a series of articles that will prove that Big Man and Spider-Man are the same person. The only problem is that there's no evidence for his wild theory. Foswell naturally brings this up, but Jameson demands that he write the article anyway, and threatens to fire him if he doesn't. So Foswell reluctantly takes up the task, although without much guidance on what to write. On his way out of Jameson's office, he runs into Betty Brant, the publisher's secretary. She's on her way out too, as she's just wrapped up a tiresome day of work. So she walks outside and waits for a taxi, but as she's waiting, she's suddenly confronted by the Enforcers and another one of Big Man's goons. They're there to make back a loan she'd taken, as although she's paid it off in full, the Big Man's just doubled the interest. Betty tries to tell them that she just doesn't have the money, but they don't care. It's then that Peter happens to walk by and notice Betty in distress. So he rushes in to see what's going on, but then gets manhandled by the Ox. While he could fight back, any serious effort would expose his identity as Spider-Man. So Betty, watching as Peter's seemingly being squeezed to death, begs the enforcers to let him go, and promises to somehow get them the money. That's exactly what they wanted to hear, as they then drop Peter to the ground, and leave to collect the money another time. Once back on his feet, Peter furiously swears revenge on the enforcers, and demands to know how Betty got herself involved with them. While we learn that she'd foolishly borrowed money from a loan shark, she refuses to tell this to Peter, as she's afraid that he'll go after them and end up getting himself hurt. So she claims it was just a case of mistaken identity, but Peter sees straight through the lie, and demands to know the truth. But Betty's too ashamed to admit her mistake, so instead of answering him, she runs off in tears. Peter, feeling betrayed by the girl he loves, angrily storms off to a nearby alley and changes into Spider-Man, 'cause if Betty's not gonna give him the answers he seeks, then he'll beat them out of the enforcers themselves. Thus we shift forward a short time later, as Spider-Man's tracked down, and webbed up, the thug that was with the enforcers. But the thug refuses to tell him anything, as he claims that in the big man's crew, the punishment for snitching is death. Thus Spider-Man realizes that if he's going to get anything out of the thug, he'll have to make himself more frightening than even the thought of death. So he blindfolds the thug with some webs, and then crafts a massive spider statue out of excess webbing and trash. He then takes off the thug's blindfold, and threatens to unleash the monster unless he talks. From a distance, the thug can't tell that it's just a dummy, so he gives Spider-Man the exact address of the enforcer's hideout. So that's where we shift to next, as Spider-Man abandons the thug, and swings his way to the hideout. But just as he's about to land on its roof, Spider-Man's suddenly snagged by a lasso. It's of course Montana's, as the Western warrior then yanks him inside, where his teammates and the big man are waiting. But they're not there to talk over tea, so the big man immediately orders his enforcers to attack. The mighty ox is the first up, although Spider-Man quickly halts him with what looks like a punch to the groin. So Fancy then rushes in to pick up the slack, as he manages to surprise Spider-Man with his freakishly fast footwork. But even though the wall crawler can't keep up, he can always rely on his spider sense. So trusting his instincts, he manages to land a solid blow that sends Fancy Dan flying. That just leaves Montana to step up to the plate, as he snags his lasso around Spider-Man's wrist, and then yanks the hero off balance. This gives Ox, having recovered from the blow to his groin, the perfect opportunity to rush in and strike Spider-Man with a hefty haymaker. I think you all get the picture from here, as Spider-Man bounces between the three enforcers, trading blow after blow. At full strength, he probably would have taken them out by now, but being weakened after the transfusion, he knows that he doesn't have the endurance to finish the enforcers. So to mask an escape, he destroys the hideout's only light, and then lets his spider sense guide him to the exit. Once outside, he heads to a nearby alley to catch his breath. While there, he happens to notice J. Jonah Jameson passing by. The coincidence raises Spider-Man's suspicion, as he begins to wonder if Jameson is actually the big man. It's not as far-fetched as it might sound, as after all, Spider-Man reasons that the big man must be someone who's rich and in the know, just like Jameson. But he knows better than to come to any conclusion, so he decides to head home and call Betty, to see if she knows why Jameson was around the enforcer's hideout. But still distraught from earlier, she picks up the phone, only to tell Peter that she can't talk, and then hang up. So there's nothing left for him to do but wait to ask her at work the next day. Yet when he arrives at the Bugle that morning, Jameson tells him that she's left town. Peter tries to press him for more information, but Jameson doesn't know anything else, and doesn't like being pestered. So he tells Peter to stop wasting his time, and orders him to go remind Fred Foswell about the column he wants, the one which'll convince everyone that Spider-Man and the big man are the same person. So Peter does just that, and asks the weary reporter if he actually believes what he's writing. Foswell remarks that it doesn't matter what he believes, as he'll write whatever Jameson wants if he can keep his job. Although Peter doesn't think it's right, he doesn't blame Foswell for just doing his job. In any case, Peter returns home that night empty-handed, as he didn't get any answers about Jameson, the enforcers are still running loose, and Betty's seemingly run out on him. If only he could get to the bottom of the big man's identity, then he could topple the crime syndicate and return things to normal. But the one shot he had as Spider-Man, he blew. But wait, what if Peter's best shot at nabbing the big man isn't as Spider-Man, but as himself? What if the only way to get close to the big man is to get captured? It's a dangerous plan, but the only one he's got. So the next day at school, Peter brags to his friends that he's discovered the big man's true identity and is gonna collect the reward offered by the police. While he doesn't actually believe him, Flash Thompson knows that even fibbing about this kind of stuff can get someone in serious trouble. So he pulls Peter aside and warns him that if he keeps yapping his mouth, the enforcers will find out and come after him. And sure enough, Flash is right, as a crusty-looking thug has just overheard their conversation. He sends the news up the criminal chain of command, and within minutes, it reaches the big man himself. Yet oddly, when the big man's told that a kid named Peter Parker is going to expose his identity, the big man reveals that he actually knows who Peter is. Whatever their relationship is, they're evidently not that close, as the big man immediately orders his enforcers to go after him. So they ambush Peter on his walk home, and force him into their car. Then on their way to their headquarters, Fancy Dan reveals to Peter that the big man somehow knows him. Peter's naturally surprised by this, and begins thinking back to his theory about Jameson. Yet as sensible as it may seem, he just can't imagine Jameson turning to crime. In any case, Peter's taken to a large indoor-outdoor parking garage that doubles as the big man's headquarters. Inside, he's shoved into a cramped, unmonitored cell. While it would prove inescapable for any normal person, Peter simply changes into the costume he's wearing under his clothes, and then easily leaps into an air vent to escape. Sneaking around the building, he stumbles onto a meeting between the big man, the enforcers, and all of the city's top mobsters. But he's so intent on listening in and discovering their plan, that his spider sense fails to warn him of a thug that creeps up from behind, and then shoves him off a ledge. Obviously he's lost the element of surprise, as the mobsters immediately swarm him. Spider-Man holds them off for a few moments, but knows that they'll eventually pull him down by sheer weight of numbers. So he hops into a nearby roadster, and starts making an escape. But he doesn't get very far, as the mighty ox grabs the car's rear bumper, and begins tipping the whole thing over. Spider-Man manages to leap out in time, but then gets tripped by a volley of rolling barrels. Yet they turn out to be just what he needs, as he uses his uncanny agility to roll one of the barrels into a crowd of mobsters. And so the battle continues, as Spider-Man smacks Montana with a barrel, staggers some mobsters with his webs, and dodges a volley of tires lobbed by the ox. It's then that the big man finally gets involved, as he dumps a bucket of oil on the ground, in the hopes that Spider-Man will slip on the slick floor. But it's only his goons who end up slipping, as Spider-Man glides across the floor like a graceful skater. But eventually they recover and start using their heads, as they realize that they can nab Spider-Man if they just rush him from all sides. Yet of course this plan fails, as at the last moment, Spider-Man leaps onto a chain that's hanging from the ceiling. But as he's swinging to safety, Fancy Dan comes in out of nowhere, and strikes him in the stomach. While the blow stuns him for a second, Spider-Man quickly recovers and gets the better of Dan. But at this point his limited endurance is starting to catch up to him. He knows that unless he signals the police and gets some rest, the mobsters are just gonna keep wearing him out. So an idea pops into his head, as he removes the spider light from his belt, attaches its tip to some webbing, and then lobs it out of the parking garage. Landing right on target, it projects the spider signal onto a nearby building that a patrol officer happens to be passing by. Recognizing it as a symbol of danger, the officer immediately calls in backup, which arrives in only 30 seconds. But back in the garage, Spider-Man's struggling to fend off the unrelenting swarm of mobsters. But just as it seems he's going to be overwhelmed, the police start up their sirens and begin surrounding the building. The big man's the only one who bothers to keep fighting, as the rest of the mobsters scramble to escape. But at this point Spider-Man's too tired to stop him, as once the big man unloads the last of his pistol, he too makes a hasty escape. Yet he's the only one who actually gets out, as the rest of the mobsters and the enforcers end up surrendering to the police. So although he let the big men slip away, Spider-Man regards the whole ordeal as a resounding success. And he's not even that concerned with the big man's escape, as he's finally convinced that he and Jameson are one and the same. So Spider-Man takes a moment to rest, and then swings to the bugle to turn him in. But just as he's about to enter Jameson's office, Fred Foswell walks in with the draft of his column. He asks Jameson if he wants to see it, but the shrewd publisher tells him to tear it up, as everything needs to be changed now that the enforcers have been captured and the crime syndicate has gone bust. Unaware of what happened at the garage, Foswell asks Jameson what's going on. But before the publisher can explain it to him, Two police officers walk into the office and declare that they've discovered the big man's true identity. Watching this from outside a window, Spider-Man assumes that the officers are there to arrest Jameson. But to his surprise, it's actually Foswell who's put into custody. The officers reveal that he'd been wearing thick-soled shoes and a padded jacket to appear larger, and used a miniature amplifier to disguise his voice. They had found the items in his car, which they'd spotted speeding away from the garage. As for why he became the big man, it's not explained, but he openly admits to his crimes, and denies that Spider-Man had any involvement. The officers then escort Foswell out of the building, leaving a humiliated Jameson to once again swear revenge on Spider-Man. But this time, after letting off a lot of steam, Jameson finally admits why he's so hellbent on destroying Spider-Man. He admits that he's jealous of the hero, as although he's worked hard to become a rich tycoon, he knows that he'll never be brave, powerful, and unselfish like Spider-Man. Thus, if he can't climb up to the hero's level, all he can do is tear him down. As for Spider-Man himself, he's made his way back home, and although he's had one crazy day, all he can think about is Betty. He knows that she's in deep trouble, but until she tells him what's going on, there's nothing he can do to help. And it doesn't seem that she's going to, as the issue ends with a dark panel, showing Betty holed up in a hotel somewhere in Pennsylvania. She's alone, afraid, and yearning to be with Peter. But whatever she's gotten herself into is serious, as she fears involving him will just lead to more sorrow. So she decides to go it alone, as the only one who could possibly help her is Spider-Man. While that concludes our story for today, Marvel has appended 2 letter pages at the end of this issue. For those unaware, letter pages were once hallmarks of the comics industry in an age before the internet. They gave Marvel an opportunity to respond to the praise, criticism, and suggestions they'd received about their stories. All of the letters presented in this issue were sent by mail to Marvel almost 60 years ago, and cover up to Amazing Spider-Man issue 6. While I won't be reading the letter pages aloud, please take a moment to look and see what readers of the time thought of this series. It's certainly an interesting experience all these years later. And with that, we've concluded Amazing Spider-Man 10, and another episode of the Classic Comic Archive. But as always, I would like to offer a brief review of this issue. Overall, I thought that this was a great story, with some really awesome action. We got 4 straight pages of brawling, and I really mean it. Spider-Man didn't have any tricks up his sleeve, he just slugged it out with a bunch of mobsters. As much as I enjoy supervillains like Doc Ock, the Lizard, and Electro, it was refreshing to see Spider-Man face some good old-fashioned crooks. With that being said, while the big man was cool, I think the issue made a mistake in not explaining his motivations. I personally didn't see the twist reveal coming, but it wasn't all that satisfying since we never learned why Foswell became the big man. But in any case, let me know what you thought of this issue and the video, and feel free to suggest other classic comics for me to cover. Thanks for watching.